fast forward to the 90s, and the banks found themselves in the same situation that the S&Ls were in, because the securitization that had worked so well in home mortgage finance now permeated all aspects of lending. Banks now found themselves displaced. And the response was the same as the S&Ls. Go to Congress, ask for liberalized investment authority. And Glass-Steagall, which was the barrier preventing banks from participating in risky businesses that were deemed too risky in the wake of the Depression, was reversed. And of course, we find ourselves with a crisis similar to the S&Ls, but in much greater magnitude. And again, like the S&Ls, not only are the losses as taxpayers that we're going to bear related to their portfolios, but the whole bubble was created because firms that didn't have taxpayer-insured deposits were forced to leverage to crazy levels, were forced out on the kind of outposts of risk, and it created the bubble. Now, you'll see here the numbers to back that up. Securitization, which I said started in the 80s and took off in the home mortgage finance business, look at what in the decade leading up to 2007, what the growth in securitization volume was in this country. $1 trillion business in 1996 became an $11 trillion business by 2007. Enormous growth. As an aside, when you think about residential real estate or office real estate values in New York City, that's $10 trillion of volume coursing through the investment banking community that propelled values to unheard of levels. Well, if securitization is no longer what it was, that's unwound. Now, securitization, as I've said already, was a new business. And really, it's been a new business. It's, let's say, a 25-year-old business. And the volume growth of this last 10, 12 years has been extreme. And like, let's say, I make the analogy to our body. If we all went out and we went out for a half-mile run, we wouldn't know the limits of our body. We could all probably make it through a half-mile run. But if we went out to run a marathon, 26 miles, we would find out our weaknesses. We'd be pushing our body to its limits. And if we had bad knees, we'd find out by the 26th mile. If we had a bad back, we'd find out by the 26th mile. Taking something to its extreme and testing it reveals all of its flaws. And that's what happened to securitization. Securitization is a new business, right? People thought they had it right, but it hasn't really evolved yet. It hadn't been through a bump. And when you take a business and you grow it fast from $1 trillion to an $11 trillion business, it's like taking your body and putting it through a marathon. All the flaws are there to be seen. And so I listed some of the flaws here for you to read, but some of it we know. The rating agencies messed up. And when they messed up, the mess up was fairly broad because the whole world had delegated credit underwriting authority to these two companies, Standard & Poor's and Moody's. In hindsight, boy, that doesn't seem like a very smart idea because if they make a mistake, the system pays for it. And maybe firms that bought bonds should have paid a little more attention to credit underwriting within their own companies and not have delegated the trust that they did to the rating agencies. Gain on sale accounting for securitization, whereby firms on Wall Street originate loans and package them and sell off all the risk and is left with a pile of money called profits from which they pay annual bonuses, obviously creates an incentive on the part of the originator to make as many loans as they can sell as fast as possible at a profit without regard to the credit quality of the loans. I think that I'm a fairly critical guy of the government, being a free market person, but I have to say that some of the things percolating around Washington today are pretty smart. They're getting some of this, and I think we're going to see securitization stay, but it's going to change, and I think gain on sale accounting is going to be one of the modifications that we see will go away. And then the last part is that, and I'm going to spend a couple minutes talking about this, the notion of liquidity. One of the reasons securitization took hold and this business grew to an $11 trillion business is this belief that's fairly broadly held that liquidity is something to be prized, that liquidity is something real, and that's something that we can pay for. So I think most investors, individual investors and institutional investors, have over the last couple of decades been persuaded by Wall Street that owning a bond that has a couple of letters next to it, AAA, AA, whatever the letters are, And buying it from your local Wall Street firm is a good thing. It's better than owning a hard asset or a loan because it's liquid, because there's a football field room back in New York with a bunch of young 25 to 35-year-old guys who make markets in those bonds. And therefore, you should pay up for that. You should be willing to accept a lower yield for that than something less liquid because the liquidity is something valuable, right? And the truth is that flaw or that fantasy was exposed in this last cycle as just a fantasy. Now, there's a couple of reasons why it's just a fantasy, but I'm going to tell you, when I was early in my career, Jen said I was a bond trader. I started off, after a short stint in the S&L business, I joined Drexel Burnham, which was really a fantastic firm in the mid-1980s. And I had the privilege of hearing Mike Milken speak, although I was a young kid starting out in the business and he was the god of Wall Street at the time. But I had the privilege of being in a small group in fixed income that got to hear him speak a couple times. And he said a few such brilliant things that they have stuck with me for the 23 years since I heard him say it. One of them I'll share with you, which is, he said, think about this, in 1986 he said this, he said, liquidity is an illusion. It's always there when you don't need it, and it's never there when you do. Now, you know, the guy's a brilliant guy, right? And he had that crystal ball. He understood in 1986 how things were likely to play out. And look at the period of time we've just been through, and that one quote, I think, really captures the essence, or a big part of the essence of some of the mistakes that were made, particularly in the name of paying up for liquidity, maybe counting on liquidity that couldn't have been there. Well, first of all, think about what liquidity means, right? It means you're able to call your Wall Street firm and get a bid for something. First of all, what we now know is many of those Wall Street firms don't exist anymore, right? Number one. Number two, well, this business, this securitization business, these bond business grew from $1 trillion business, outstanding volume, to an $11 trillion business. So the promise of making a market and having enough capital to back that up is very different for $1 trillion business than for an $11 trillion business. And the fact is, people weren't paying attention. Wall Street didn't have the capital base to back the promise of liquidity up in an $11 trillion business. And firms like Bear Stearns stretched the limits of their balance sheet with excessive leverage in order to try to deliver that promise, because it was important, that illusion of liquidity was important to their business model. And ultimately, they died trying.